And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You know, with all the news that you see every day, with turning on the TV or opening up your phone and seeing about one calamity or disaster, it's easy to forget in these times just how blessed we are to be living in 21st century America. We are living in a time and a place that has more possessions, more sort of goods, more things for us to enjoy than at any time in the history of the world. And again, it's easy to forget this. Think about it. We could go into a grocery store, and yesterday I got blackberries in the middle of winter. Think about that. A few generations ago, that would be unthinkable. Now, these blackberries weren't exactly sweet or ripe, but they were there. I mean, you want to see an amazing thing. You walk into like a Costco, and you're like, wow, this is incredible. You think about the space that we have. As time has gone on, all across America, houses get bigger. There's more space for everyone. When I was growing up, I shared a room with my brother. Now, most siblings have their own space. Multiple cars, televisions. There's endless entertainment you can find. You hold a supercomputer in your palm of your hand where you have access to the entire World Wide Web. Think about that. You have access to the kind of thing that in the old days only the best libraries in the world might have. You have at any moment you want. That's remarkable. You have leisure time. You can get on planes and fly across the globe. For the vast majority of human history, our world was within 20 miles of where we grew up. Now you can go see the great sights of the globe, have your mind expanded, meet people that are entirely different. We have access to education, the incredible education and stores of knowledge of thousands of years. Do you realize how rare this is? How unusual this is? Amazing cultural things. You name it from top to bottom, our lives are pretty amazing. Our access to it is pretty amazing. Our access to medicine and health, you go back 150 years, none of that was there. Think of how blessed we are. It's easy to lose sight of that. But at the same time, all of this incredible blessing does come with a cost. Because you see, we are evolutionarily hardwired to be hunter-gatherers. What we really want is like certain moments of really intensity, and then you get that woolly mammoth, and you sit down and you feast for like the next 3 days. That's what we're hardwired to do. But unfortunately, the way that our economy is set up, we're set up to wake up, work all day long, go to bed, work all day long, go to bed. When you have a break, you take a little break you can, and then you go back to working all day long. So there's this amazing tension we have. We have more now than we've ever had, but we're also so busy that we rarely have time to think or reflect. There's some irony to this where, philosophers of the past would say, oh, the advantage of mechanization, the advantage of industrialization is that people will have more leisure time. It hasn't quite worked out that way. And this is relevant because we're now entering the season of Lent. And Lent is a time for reflection. That thing that we almost never get the chance to do, to sit back and reflect on the big questions of life. We're very good about practical things. We're very good about coming up with solutions. We're very good about to-do lists and busying our days. But how often do we get a season set aside where the intention is to reflect deeply? Now, our text for this morning that Marielle read earlier from Job is itself a wonderful thought experiment. The entire book of Job is a thought experiment. There are not historical markers in Job. It's not meant to be a historical text. The whole thing is set up as there is this perfect individual who never does anything wrong, who always goes to church every week. I'm like, that's fantastic. Says all of his prayers. Even says prayers on behalf of his children in case they hadn't done that. And so God's up there in heaven, and God's just sitting with the heavenly beings and being like, see that guy Job? He's pretty darn good, isn't he? It's perfect. It's perfect. And then Satan, who's not the devil in this case, this is before the concept of the devil really as we think of it came to being. This is Satan as sort of like someone who's like a needler, someone who like, it's a devil's advocate, we'd say today. So the Satan figure comes up to God and said, yeah, well, of course Job is so great. Job has everything going for him. Nothing is wrong with him. You make life tough, you'll see what happens. And so God says, all right, deal. So they make a bet with Job's life right there. Okay, done. And then the rest of the book of Job unfolds. It's all a thought experiment. What happens when the things that insulate us aren't there anymore? Then what? Because when that happens, we get to see what our values actually are. And that's precisely what goes on in our All Church Read This Lent Shantung compound. You too can own a copy of this book. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the book is, it's an interesting text. It's written by a guy named Landon Gilkey, who later spent his career as a theologian at the University of Chicago. And Gilkey was actually the son of the dean of the chapel at the University of Chicago. Went to Harvard College, graduated in 1940. And like many young people, even though he was raised in the church, he's like, church is not for me. My dad's foolish. His theological beliefs are foolish and outdated. I'm a young man, a man of the times, a rational thinker. And so he graduates in 1940, but he decides he wants to go teach English. And so he teaches English at what was then called Peking University, which was an old missionary university in Beijing. So in 1940, he goes over to teach there. Now, this was a pretty bold move. Again, young guy obviously wants adventure. At that point, Eastern China was under Japanese occupation. So he's going into Japanese-occupied China to teach at one of these missionary universities that's there. But this was 1940. Then, of course, December 1941, things change a bit. All of a sudden, the United States is at war with Japan. And then in early 1943, he and all the other foreign nationals living in occupied China are told that they're going to be rounded up and put into internment camps. Now, these are not concentration camps. This is not Auschwitz. Okay, these are internment camps. The Japanese want to make sure there aren't any internal threats within China, just like the United States did with Japanese Americans during World War II, put into an internment camp. And so here's Landon Gilkey living his life, teaching at this university, and all of a sudden, he gets a note in the mail saying, time to pack up all your things, or at least this small little group of things, your life's about to change. Now, if that happened to you, and you were told you could pack a suitcase for the next however many years, what would you put in that suitcase? I'm curious. What do you really care about that you're like, oh, if I'm gone for an indeterminate number of years and I'm going to this internment camp, what do you take with you? I think the thing that would scare a lot of people is access to medicine. We're so reliant these days on medications, particularly older Americans, that, that's a real fear if you're going to this internment camp. Will I get access to that? So you're certainly stuff as many of those in as you can. What would you miss of the things that you couldn't take? Like if you couldn't guarantee a power supply where you're going, would you miss your phones? If you couldn't guarantee cell service? What do you think that you would be glad to be freed of if this happened? It's an interesting thought experiment. Again, this is Lent, time for deep thinking. What are those things of all that we have that actually matter most? Only when you have a situation like Job's or like Gilkey's do we get to see that. And underlying it all are the values that drive us. What matters most? Now, here's the thing. It's easy to sit back and say, hey, I am not teaching at Peking University in 1940. We are not in the middle of World War II. I'm not likely to be rounded up and sent to an internment camp. Why do I need to think about a book like this one? Well, we might not be that far off from things that force us to consider our values. Let's say, for instance, China was to cross the Taiwan Straits and invade Taiwan. And the United States found itself in war with China. Most war games have it that within the first few weeks, China's hypersonic missiles would knock out most of our carrier groups in the Pacific, killing tens of thousands of Americans. Like that. All of a sudden, you have to ask yourself, if we're at war with China, or with Russia, or with Iran, where does your patriotism come in? What do you value? What if that meant that your children or grandchildren were going off to war? Wars are expensive. Where does the money come from? Here's the bad news. When you get to a war like that one, a war with, say, China, you go where the money is. And over the last 40 years, the money's gone to predominantly one place. That's where the money's coming from if we go to war. What would you think of those Americans who were super wealthy who then left the country to try and maintain their wealth and avoid serving? What are your values? We are now approaching potentially a debt crisis in the United States. Our debt is already over 100% of GDP. Most economists say that that's an important threshold to cross. We've crossed that threshold. And here's the fascinating thing. You look at either leading candidate for the election in 2024, neither of them are going to cut the debt. That's just reality. And as things get, as interest rates stay high and more pressure builds, all of a sudden choices have to be made. So where are your values? Who gets cut? The military? Social Security, Medicare? Do you want to see your Social Security, Medicare cut? Medicaid, that supports people who are poor, disabled? Who are the people who lose out? This is where one of the things I'm concerned about in the years ahead is a generational war, where all of a sudden you'll have, as Social Security and Medicare go bankrupt, you'll have older Americans who vote in large numbers saying, oh, we want to make sure those payments keep going. And then you'll have younger Americans who are saying, not a chance, because we're not going to get any of it when it's our time. What are your values? This is where values come in. Where do you stand? What about the impending environmental crisis, where all of a sudden people in low-lying communities are like, hey, you're not getting insurance. Currently, there's all these different things to bail people out whose houses are in potential threat. That's going to stop at some point. What impact does this have on wealthy people with their homes and their political sort of capital that they use? What does it happen? What does this mean with people who are poor and oftentimes minorities who might have to move? Like, again, look at what happened in New Orleans after Katrina. Environmental things bring up big questions. Would you be willing to give up amount of a GDP in order to support environmental change? These things are on the horizon. This isn't like, 30 years from now we have to think about this. What about the AI revolution that's coming? I mean, we saw with industrialization a big dislocation of employees, right? But that happened over a number of years. The speed at which AI is developing is even surprising those who are in the field. You give it 10 years, you've got potentially tens of millions of people who no longer have jobs. What happens then? Talk about political instability. Isn't this fun? You get to come to church on Sunday. It's like, oh, church is so much fun this morning. You missed it. It was Lent. But also personal crises we have also bring up questions of values. When we lose our jobs, you have to figure out what matters, what doesn't. When you have a death in the family, when you have a serious illness in the family, it brings up questions of values. And that's precisely what this book, Shantung Compound, does. Is it looks at people in a difficult situation and it looks at the values that emerges. The reason why people study theology and ethics is so that you can figure out what you believe and why, so that when situations arise, you can act with integrity. When I taught at Groton School, one of the courses I taught was a course on social justice. It was an ethics course. And I began the course by writing an Upton Sinclair quote on the board. And I said, the Upton Sinclair quote is, it's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. Human beings have tremendous capacities for justification. We can justify virtually anything. The question is, should we be? What are the underlying ethics that are at play? And so I told the students, I said, I can give you an ethical system that can justify anything. and it's got rationality. The question is, what ethical system matters for you and why? In the year 180 AD, there was a great plague in the Roman Empire, particularly brutal in the Western Roman Empire. Demographers say that for the next 150 years, it affected the population of the Western Roman Empire. And there were accounts at the time that as everyone was fleeing cities when the plague arrived, Christians stayed behind. They stayed behind to care for those who were dying and then to bury those who were dead, knowing full well that it would almost certainly mean their own lives as well. Crisis came, they knew where their values lay, and then they lived them. What role for all of us does God play in our lives in structuring our values? What role does the model of Jesus play in our lives in structuring our values? When we get into difficult circumstances, this is when this emerges. And some people, remarkably, can go through life and never consider these things. I had dinner a few weeks ago with a friend of mine, or just an acquaintance I hadn't seen in a long time. It's a guy who graduated Harvard College, then he got his JD MBA from Harvard, then went out to Silicon Valley, worked in private equity, made tens of millions of dollars, finds himself in his 40s right now, and he's sitting there with this midlife crisis, and he's like, I don't know what I'm doing in my life. The problem with him is he's always had success throughout his entire life. He never actually, I asked him at one point, I said, have you ever failed in life? And he's like, no, not really. And I'm like, that's too bad. Because now you're in your mid-40s and you have no idea what you're doing in life. I'm like, why don't you retire? He's like, well, then what would I do? I have no relevance. I'm like, is that what you rate your self-worth on? What other people think about your relevance? That's how you get up in the morning, you know? I mean, my mind was blown. He had never once thought about his values, about what actually matters. And so during Lent, that's what we're going to do. Basically, it turns out that when you are someone who has values and principles, it allows you to deal with the various vicissitudes that life will inevitably throw at you. But you've got to think about them and reflect on them beforehand. So again, in your orders of service, it's a sheet of paper where you can sign up for one of these groups to discuss things if you want to discuss this book. It's broken down into 5 simple readings. We have copies available. We have electronic copies available if you want. We also have reading guides where you can follow it and read it on your own. But I encourage you to do it because it'll make you think. It'll make you think about values. And after all, that is what Lent is all about.